Hello, Stephanaires, and I hope I am saying that correctly, and if I am not, I do apologize. This is another video I'm making. Now, the problem with discussions of these kinds, and I've had many of them, and I suspect you've had some yourself, perhaps many also, I don't know, is that the concepts of words like capitalism, socialism, and democracy, and a host of others, not Marxism, but are pretty vague, and it makes it very difficult to really have a detailed and meaningful discussion on them because they could mean anything. I mean, I believe in free markets. I'm an anarcho-capitalist. I believe in capitalism, but there are many thousands of other capitalists whose ideas are perhaps similar in some ways, but perhaps completely mutually exclusive in others. The one who comes to mind, who's most famous with me, who I would disagree with the most, there's two probably, and those would be Ayn Rand and Milton Friedman. And although I like these people for certain reasons, I disagree with them very strongly on several very important issues. And so, not to be real specific about it, but this makes it really hard because if you're going to attack me and say, well, look at Friedman, this, or Ayn Rand, this, it may or may not be applicable, and I'm fully aware that this same handicap applies to anything I might say to you. I've talked to many socialists, and very few of them have identical concepts. Now, I've isolated certain commonalities or certain strains, and I feel comfortable debating any of them, but until I actually know what yours is in more detail, I'm not comfortable being too explicit on what I think is wrong with it. I mean, if you believe in representative democracy, that's one thing. If you believe in absolute democracy, that's another. If you're an anarcho-syndicalist, that's one thing. If you're just a statist, that's another. If you're a communist, if you're just a liberal Democrat, if you're a neoconservative, even conservative. I mean, I consider conservatives to be socialists at least half. You know, if you believe in a military, that's socialism to me. You know, if you believe in a central bank and a state-controlled currency, that's socialism, and that's the majority of so-called capitalists right there. So, although I'm not an objectivist, I will say I like Ayn Rand's. I don't think she came up with it, but her term of floating abstraction. They're just not in their common usage. These terms are just not specific enough. You know, we need to be closer. Now, capitalism is handicapped because Marx came up with the term, and I don't think there's anything per se wrong with the term other than like capital is everywhere. There's no system that doesn't use capital. You can be the most centrally planned socialist democratic society, and you still have to have capital. You have to have at least as much capital as any other society. So, you know, wouldn't that make the USSR a capitalist country? You know, or any theoretical socialist society you might imagine? Wouldn't that be capitalism? And on the other hand, any society at all where there are individuals interacting with each other, that is to say, where there's more than one person and they're not atomistically isolated from each other, that's going to have a society, and so it could be called socialism, quite legitimately. If you just look at the etymology of the words, it makes sense. And even within the, I mean, so it's difficult, and that's why it's really hard to just jump into these debates. And so this is kind of more of a feeling out of your position, I guess. Now, in your video, one of them, I believe it's the Addressing Socialism video. It may have been one of the subsequent ones. You're trying to describe your type of socialism, or what you call just socialism, but I presume what you mean is your view of it. And you call it Well, it's basically democracy. Well, the same problem applies to democracy. I don't know what you mean by that. Uh, Democracy has been used to mean many, many different things, but I will tell you, I don't care what meaning you have of it unless you're taking the most uh, vague concept of the term. For me, that doesn't prove anything. You know, democracy is basically the shibboleth of our civic religion. We're all taught in school that democracy is the apogee of societal development, that it is the panacea solvent of all social ills. Now, does that mean democracy as in representatives, or there's just voting? Usually it's going to imply some kind of political decision making revolving around the majority of some electorate. The thing is this isn't convincing logically or empirically. There's no empirical evidence that democracy yields desirable results by any ethical standard other than the ethical standard that says whatever a majority votes is inherently normative. And although this argument is implied a lot, I don't think anyone could really make it, because a majority can vote to do anything, including the most atrocious things possible. And if your stance is that, well, whatever a majority votes for is moral, then you have to allow for things that I would say basically everyone would acknowledge are immoral. You know, slavery had a majority support in the United States. There were 4 million slaves. There were 26 million non-slaves in the United States at the onset of the Civil War. And even though there wasn't slavery legal in much of the North, it actually was legal in parts of the North, they still favored it. Only a minority of people were abolitionists. They were a minority, which means in democracy, minorities, it means nothing. It means no power. You know, people say, oh, you get a voice. Actually, you don't get a voice if you're a minority. If you're a minority, your voice counts for nothing. It's winner take all. It's like the Electoral College. You know, it doesn't matter if someone gets 30 million votes. You'd think 30 million is a big constituency, but if there's 100 million people who vote, it doesn't matter. There's no evidence that the decisions of majority electorates are wise or that they are correct in any meaningful sense, other than to be syllogistic about it and say whatever a majority decides is itself correct. And this logically can't be, because they can contradict each other. You know, aside from the fact that, you know, mathematically 2 + 2 is 4. You know, are you going to say that if a majority votes differently that it's not? And even if you did, then what if today they vote that it's 5 and tomorrow they vote that it's 6? They both can't be true. Now, this is basic Aristotelian logic here that is not the foundation, but is a foundation of our entire civilization. You know, and it just doesn't make any logical sense to say otherwise. So democracy is interesting because it is basically all it is right now is something that we're emotionally conditioned to respect, and it exists not because it makes any sense, but because it's useful to the state. It gives the state legitimacy by saying we've been elected. It's like the mandate of heaven. You know, it used to be that monarchs would say, well, I have legitimacy because gods or a god has given it to me. And you have a religious, superstitious populace, and they can be induced to accept this. Well, that's not popular anymore in most places. But what they have done is come up with this social contract theory, which is completely bogus. Instead of having a mandate of heaven, we have a mandate of a majority. A majority of an electorate, by the way, because in practice it's almost never ever a majority of the population. And we still have a superstitious populace who believes that if you get a majority vote, then it's somehow okay. It's interesting in the case of the United States, where there's practically nobody in the United States who would say that when the 13 colonies rebelled against Great Britain, that was unjustified. That's universally hailed as patriotic and heroic, against the king. But if you suggest secession today, it's considered evil. And what's the one argument they have against it? Is that, well, the government now is elected. As if the king had been elected, then the revolution would have been an evil rebellion against humanity and civilization. But since he was hereditary, it was, laudable. This doesn't make any sense. And so I don't think you can take it for granted that just calling something democratic ipso facto makes it correct or desirable. And I would strongly, strongly disagree with that. There are many, many problems with democracy in any of its forms, other than the most broad, to say whatever the people are doing. I've made a number of videos on it over the last couple months. I'd be happy to direct you to them, but I think I call them Democracy the Myth, or Democracy the God That Failed. There's a couple problems. I guess I'll touch on them real brief. One is the gerrymandering problem. If you have the majority of some electorate deciding or making decisions, then the makeup of that electorate decides what gets done. And so you and I could have a disagreement, and we could say, well, let's put it to a vote. Obviously, the two of us are just going to nullify each other's vote, but if I say, well, I have my 4 libertarian friends, they're going to join us, they'll be the other voters, then you're going to just say, well, that's no fair, because you're going to win because you brought in your libertarian friends or your cousins or whatever. But at the same time, then you could say, well, I'm going to bring in my 10 socialist friends. Well, how do we decide? We can't vote on it, because that's the very issue at hand. What is the electorate? You can't democratically through voting pick the electorates. The only ways you could do this would be if there was unanimity. If everybody agreed, then there wouldn't be a need to vote. Or to just have some dictator, either a person or some oligopoly or oligarchy, saying, oh, well, this group is this electorate, this group is that electorate. I mean, I know that there are cliched retorts to this, like, well, you should vote to whatever you're most involved in or whatever, but that's the very question, like if we have 10 people working in a factory, but we have 1 or 2 other people who maybe worked at the factory before, who want to work at the factory, who's to say they don't have a vote? Can't they come and say, well, okay, maybe we have half a vote, but there's twice as many of us. We can't vote on it. It doesn't make any sense. Then there's an incentive problem with voting. Since I only have a fraction of the decision making, and it depends on the electorate what that fraction is, and the costs and benefits of the decision are divided, then it doesn't make that much sense for me to invest a whole lot of time. And this is like an empirical fact. If you look at any presidential, you must be aware of this. You seem like you're pretty politically aware. You realize that the vast majority of people who vote, especially in national elections, they don't know anything about either of the candidates, their platforms, their parties, or their positions. They know very, very little. Mostly they just care what the letter is in front of their name. And second to that, they care what they look like, or a good speech that they gave. They don't invest hours and hours and hours researching, which they'd have to invest much more than that to have anything even close to an informed opinion. But why should they when their vote is only worth 1/50 millionth? It doesn't make any sense, because your vote will be nullified by the thousands of people who are just going to vote for the guy with the R in front of his name. And this is like an empirical fact. It's obvious. I'd love to hear you deny this and say, oh, no, people when they vote really think about it, and really, no, they're incentivized not to. And there's a reason for that. And this video is getting a little bit long. I think I can only make 15-minute videos, and my clock says 14:30, so I'm going to pick it up. I don't know how much longer the following one will be, but all right, we'll see where this goes.